Rwandan-backed rebels advance in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. They've captured a regional capital and are vowing to reach Kinshasa. The conflict is causing a humanitarian crisis. Can mediation by regional leaders stop the fighting? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Hundreds of people killed, hundreds of thousands forced from their homes. A week-long offensive by Rwandan-backed rebels in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo is spiralling into a regional crisis. UN experts estimated last year close to 4,000 Rwandan soldiers are involved. Kinshasa says the M23 armed group wants to control the area that's rich in minerals. Rwanda denies supporting the rebels and says it's deployed troops to stop the fighting from spreading into its territory. Leaders from southern and eastern Africa are trying to mediate between the two sides. Will their efforts succeed, or could the crisis expand into a wider conflict? We'll discuss all of this with our panel of experts shortly. But first, this report from Joel Evans.
In the last week, a decade-long conflict has intensified as the Rwandan-backed rebels captured the city of Goma in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Hundreds of civilians have been entering the North Kivu capital, searching for safety since last year, when rebel forces led by M23 began occupying territory in the province. Now some are returning home.
I'm going back home because M23 urged us to come back, and they said our security was guaranteed, and I believe it is now.
Hospitals in Goma are struggling to cope with an influx of wounded people days after fighters seize control.
We have been facing several cases of mass casualties. We are receiving injured people from all over, and we have treated more than 1,000 wounded at this hospital. Among them are women, children, and even pregnant women.
A Congolese government spokesperson says hundreds of people have been killed and thousands injured in the latest fighting.
It was around 1 p.m. on Sunday when I was in my tent with other people and a bullet hit me in the abdomen. I didn't know where it came from. My friends immediately took me and brought me here to the hospital. Since Sunday, they have been treating me and I have started to recover.
M23 is one of several groups competing for control of Congo's east, which holds huge deposits of minerals critical to much of the world's advanced technology. United Nations experts say the group is backed by 4,000 troops from neighbouring Rwanda. As they push forward, pressure is mounting on Rwanda over the alleged support. During a summit, leaders of the Southern African Development Community expressed concern over heavy losses suffered by its combined task force and discussed next steps for the community's mission in the DRC. Rwandan President Paul Kagame rejected criticism over his country's role in the conflict.
M23 are not Rwandans, please.
Rwanda is also facing backlash from further afield. The United States has told Kigali it is deeply troubled by the fall of Goma. Germany has cancelled aid talks with Rwanda, while Britain has said $40 million of annual assistance is under threat. The Southern African Development Community have pledged to continue working towards a solution, and until then the future of tens of thousands of people remains uncertain. Joel Evans, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss this further with our panel of guests today who are joining us. In Nairobi, we have Nicodemus Minde, a researcher with the East Africa Peace and Security Governance Programme at the Institute for Security Studies. In Cape Town in South Africa, Crystal Orderson is a journalist for the Africa Report, a quarterly magazine that focuses on African politics and economics. She spent a decade reporting from conflict zones on the continent. And in New York, Yinka Adegoke is editor of Semafor Africa, part of the Semafor Global News website. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. Maybe start, I think, if I can, with you, Crystal, because it's been a grim situation in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo for years and years and years. but rarely has it been as bad as this.
Absolutely, James. We see thousands of people being displaced. We see hospitals overrun. And I think it's a humanitarian tragedy that is unfolding. Last year, this time, we were talking about this. It's been an issue literally for almost 30 years, and there's been very little effort to actually deal with the issue. We know that in 2012, Goma also fell, but through mediation and talks, we saw then that the troops withdrew, and now we're seeing this absolute offensive. And of course, on the ground, it's absolutely atrocious. And here in South Africa, of course, the big talk is because we've got the largest contingent fighting in that SADC contingent in the DRC, the death toll now at 14 South African soldiers and 3 Malawian. So it's a big domestic issue here as well, that there is a big issue. One, South Africa is already preparing for an influx of refugees from the DRC. And then secondly, militarily, huge criticism here in South Africa because there's a feeling that the SADC troops are ill-prepared, ill-equipped, and they are not surprised at the death toll in Goma, and they're expecting that death toll of soldiers alone and the humanitarian crisis to actually increase.
Yinka, we have this situation in Goma, which is a city that's got a swelled population because already so many displaced people had gone to Goma. Fears, the UN say, about clean water, food, medical supplies. But of course, the added thing is that Goma was the regional humanitarian hub, dealing all the humanitarian aid really was being distributed from Goma.
Yeah, I mean, this is totally correct. I mean, for months now, people have been streaming into Goma as a way to, get away from sort of the military threat that exists in the region. And the point you made, was made in the report earlier about this spreading is a real concern. You have to understand that DRC alone, but including Rwanda, Uganda, this region spreads over a space that covers the size of Western Europe. This is a really serious concern. So it's something that we're going to have to see what happens next in terms of the way this is addressed.
Nicodemus, can we just look back quickly at what happened militarily in the last week? Because M23 did get a pretty spectacular victory given the forces that were in Goma, because you had the Congolese army, you had militia that were backed by the Democratic Republic of Congo, you had some mercenaries, I believe there were Romanian and French mercenaries that had been hired by the Congolese government, you had soldiers from Burundi, which were fighting on the side of the DRC, and then they also managed to bypass the regional peacekeeping force and the UN peacekeeping force. I mean, quite amazing, really.
Yeah, you can understand from that question the complexity and the multiplicity of actors that are involved in this conflict. And of course, in order for us to really ask the right questions, it's also important to understand the historical, geopolitical, as well as the contemporary factors that have led to this particular flaring up of the conflict in the past week or so. So you look at failed peace processes emanating from the failed or the fragile Rwanda process, which is an AU-backed process, which again, late December 2024, we saw the President Kagame failing to attend the signing of an agreement. And of course, this led to this series of events that have been experienced in the early months of January, leading to the take of other towns such as Masisi, Minova, ultimately Sake, and then of course, what we saw this week with the taking over of Goma. So you can understand the historical, contextual, as well as the multiplicity of actors that are really exacerbating the situation currently.
Crystal, we still have President Kagame denying that his government supports M23. He used to say that he had no troops in in Congo either, but now they do admit they've got troops because even the UN is saying they estimate they've got about at least 4,000 troops in the country. A Rwandan government spokeswoman said recently, we're not interested in war, we're not interested in annexation, we're not interested in regime change. Do you believe that? What do you think Rwanda's real aim is?
No, I don't believe it, James, because since 2012, different UN panel of experts, which I'm sure reports that you have seen too, have pointed out the Rwandese involvement with M23. And of course, every time that is mentioned, Rwanda makes it very clear that they are not supporting M23. We just saw in South Africa this week an absolute public relations offensive by Rwanda on our airwaves every day, from the foreign minister to the spokesperson, really denying this. But we know that UN expert panels have people on the ground. I mean, these reports are thoroughly investigated. So by the time it gets to the UN Security Council, there's been absolute fact check. And so we've had this tit for tat with Rwanda denying supporting M23. And I think leaders and the UN in particular have been very soft. We know that Rwanda, we know the different reports coming out around the mineral wealth being exported, etc. I think the evidence is all there. But I think there's been, and what's interesting this week, we saw President Cyril Ramaphosa being very clear about saying that troops cannot be killed. And if this continues, there will be consequences, basically declaring war. And we immediately saw Paul Kagame getting so angry, taking to social media, literally attacking Cyril Ramaphosa and basically accusing him of lying and also then further threatening war. It was very interesting, this play of words between the two leaders. And I do think, again, I think at least the way we see it is that clearly Cyril Ramaphosa has touched the nerve of Paul Kagame and calling him out immediately. What is different, I think, is that Cyril Ramaphosa was part of the SADC heads of state meeting that took place in Harare later like last week. And so we see SADC leaders coming very firm in terms of their support, firstly, for the SADC troops. So if Kagame is thinking that the SADC troops will be leaving Eastern Congo, that's not going to happen. I do think what is very clear is that SADC, and especially South Africa, needs to put pressure on Kinshasa and Felix Tshisekedi in particular, because he's absolutely been silent on this matter, except for comment here.
Yinka, we'll come back to that very fraught diplomatic picture and what can be done in a moment. But I'd like to get to a very basic point, I think, for our viewers who perhaps haven't been to the region. I've only visited Goma and the DRC once, and it's very evident when you get there, Goma is right on the border with Rwanda. And the distance between the Rwandan capital, Kigali, is just 100 kilometres from Goma, whereas the capital of DRC, Kinshasa, is over 1,500 kilometres away. Rwanda sees this at its backyard, its sphere of influence, does it not?
Yeah, it certainly does in terms of Goma, but obviously there's also, it's not just about distance, it's also about, the ethnic ties between the Tutsis who essentially lead Rwanda.
And that takes us back to the 1994 genocide, which is still a factor in this, yes?
100% it is. It's even though you would have thought nearly 30 years later now, more than 30 years later, you would have thought that many of those people would have died and or got old. But this is very much a factor when you listen to the kinds of things that the leaders of the rebels talk about. They might be younger people, but it's still a huge concern in that region. It's not just about the distance. It's about the fact that they believe they are an oppressed people and that they need to defend themselves. They need to defend the region, and they also have support from the Rwandans, even though the Rwandans deny it, and even though they also try sometimes to claim that Rwanda has nothing to do with it, that they are Congolese, and that they simply want to, defend themselves. But they've now moved beyond that and it's becoming the M23 themselves have now aligned with the Congo River Alliance, and this is becoming more of a nationalist movement now, and that they are the ones now saying we are going to Kinshasa. Now, some experts feel they don't have enough troops, but frankly, in military terms, it could be more about their organization and the weakness of the DRC government, and DRC organization. So this could become quite serious if they do move forward, and it wouldn't just be about Rwanda. It would be about who actually controls the entire country of the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Nicodemus, on that point, as you just heard from Yinka there, the M23 part now of a wider alliance. Is that just window dressing to make it look like it's not just the M23, or is that a real thing? And do you think there is a real prospect of them going all the way to Kinshasa, a vast distance in a vast country? But it is worth reminding people that there was a precedent that Rwanda helped the former leader, Laurent Kabila, in a campaign that toppled Mobutu, the dictator, back in 1997.
Well, of course, that's the historical nuance that I mentioned in my introduction, that, of course, there is this historical factor that stems from this, the 1994 aftermath of the genocide, and which, when you ask about the role of Rwanda in all this, they will always claim that the remnants of this 1994 genocide are stationed or moved to Eastern Congo and have organized themselves in the form of these FDLR forces, which is a Hutu rebel group, which Rwanda accuses the DRC of working in cahoots with them. So you can understand Rwanda's fears, and of course you mentioned the ethnic angles as well as the geographical proximity and the geopolitical factors. But again, going back to the question of whether or not there could be they could spread beyond Goma. Of course, the threats that have been given right now with the AFC, that is the Alliance of the River Alliance, the Congo River Alliance, is you could see they want to capture the cities such as Bukavu, that is in South Kivu, and of course they've made a threat that they will want to proceed and conquer Kinshasa, and you can see some form of geopolitical as well as internal domestic factors, ranging from this historical enmity that came from the historical factors such as the First and Second Congo War that ultimately led to the dethroning of Mobutu Sese Seko and coming of Laurent Kabila, and you can understand this interplay that is, of course, worry currently, and of course this regional efforts as well as international pressure is an attempt to really rein in on the prospects, which again, going by precedents, are looking it could actually lead to the march to Kinshasa as they have actually claimed.
Crystal, whether they're heading to Kinshasa or not, it does seem they're now moving from Goma, which is in North Kivu, towards South Kivu. How worrying is that? And does it also have implications for Burundi? Because South Kivu borders Burundi. Burundi has interests in South Kivu.
Burundi indicated already that they see this as a serious threat and they will pick up arms, which again is a major concern because, as our colleague said, Nicodemus, we could see this then, just engulf the entire region. I think my challenge is that this comes at a time where geopolitics is fast changing with the Trump presidency. We saw US aid being cut. We know the consequences of those aid cuts are dire, not just in Congo, but across Africa. And with the dire humanitarian situation unfolding, I think not just in Goma, in other parts, there's going to be very little appetite for humanitarian support. And this is where you really need actors like the EU, like the UA, like the UK and the US to really come out strong and force Rwanda and the DRC to the mediation table. I mean, we saw with Kenya and Angola as the regional mediators. I think there's criticism because we see William Ruto moving on some aspects, but we don't see Angola coming out strongly to get the parties. The last talks were held in December, and we know that Tshisekedi didn't pitch up, which of course caused some more anger between Rwanda and the DRC. And I think ultimately, for me, the concern is, given the dire state of geopolitics in the world, it's ultimately innocent women and children and communities that are going to continue being displaced. And there's going to be very little appetite for a large-scale humanitarian effort to take place. And I do think this is where the UN need to come on board to force a humanitarian corridor so that food can be brought in, because we're going to see stories in the next couple of days where people are not going to have food to eat. And I think for me, ultimately, it's the dire humanitarian situation on the ground that is just going to become worse, and soldiers are just going to continue picking up arms, and countries will just sit back and allow another disaster unfolding right in front of our eyes.
Yinka, when I listen to Crystal there describing the diplomatic efforts, and we've also talked about all the different peacekeeping efforts that have been going on, it seems very fragmented. There doesn't seem to be a coordinated regional international strategy. You had both a regional force and a UN force in Goma. Earlier on, you had an East African force. You'd had negotiations by Angola, negotiations by Kenya. Doesn't everyone need to get on the same page? And isn't it, in many ways, the same problem that we have in terms of the response to another man-made tragedy in Africa, Sudan?
Yeah, very, very similar. And also just this idea of everybody working separately. I think, actually, my belief is that a lot of the pressure, as happened in 2012, actually needs to come from the international community outside of Africa, particularly with regards to Rwanda, and putting pressure on them, because so much of their ambitions and their economy are tied to Western powers, and Western powers could really have an impact. Now, if you look at this moment, we're in a very strange moment to touch on that point that Crystal made there about the Trump administration, which hasn't quite isn't fully in place as far as foreign affairs is concerned. We have the Secretary of State, but we haven't got the Africa team fully in place yet. And it seems like I know from reporting that there were the Congolese foreign minister was here last week trying to meet people, and no one was really available. There's a real attempt. The Rwandans are doing the same thing, reaching out to lobbyists and all trying to have some sort of say on how they can work together on this. But really, there's a real sort of vacuum, if you like, through which a lot of this sort of confusion is happening. And the regional powers the regional powers on the continent will try and work together, but not in the way that international forces could probably force everyone to the same table. And that's kind of what's happening here. There's a little bit of a vacuum.
Nicodemus, when we look at those Western countries that Yinka just mentioned, who he says need to put more pressure on Rwanda, I mean, they are perhaps saying tougher words, but they seem torn, some of these countries. They seem to have a soft spot for Rwanda. I mean, speaking to diplomats, they've said to me in the past, Rwanda is stable, it's efficient, it's relatively not corrupt.
Well, of course, Rwanda has done its share of good international branding, and to this great extent has affected the way Rwanda has been able to be portrayed in international standing, and it is working out for them. But of course, we can see from the United Nations Security Council meeting that was convened on an emergency, session, there were very harsh criticisms of the role of Rwanda. Previous countries that have taken a more subtle approach to this issue have now come out, very strongly, including the United Kingdom. The United States have issued very strong, statements against Rwanda
Okay. Well,
forces
let me pick that point up with Crystal, because the French, and I was speaking to the French ambassador in New York just a couple of days ago about this. They are now proposing a draft resolution to the UN Security Council. The French ambassador to the UN, pretty clear that pressure needs to be put on Rwanda. But when you speak to diplomats at the UN Security Council, guess which countries are the ones that don't want to name Rwanda? The African countries.
The US, the UK, and the EU, and France in particular, have influence. They've said that they are re-looking at aid. We've not seen sanctions. We've not seen travel bans. We've not seen anything of real impact actually being done on Rwanda. It's always threats, but it never happens. We need to also criticize Felix Tshisekedi. I think firstly, his government, we know, he's also has his own opposition in Kinshasa. He's not being able to actually get the entire kind of, whether members of parliament, etc., behind him. And so I also do think that he tends to be very emotional, and, he doesn't attend peace talks, or he doesn't attend mediation talks. And I think there needs to be some pressure being put on Felix Tshisekedi. And I think this is where Southern Africa and South Africa in particular have to call Felix Tshisekedi to order, because you ultimately, whatever you want, James, this can only be solved one way, through mediation, getting regional actors like Burundi, like Uganda around the table, getting the mediators, Kenya and Angola, really to get Rwanda and Kinshasa around one table. And South Africa and SADC's influence in Kinshasa has to be, they have to turn the taps closed and force Tshisekedi to the table, because I think ultimately he is at the moment not being, his government is weak, and he is weak, and we see the emotive responses coming from him. And I don't think that is helping, because the one thing that Rwanda is on message, they're very clear. In fact, Kagame just sent out a statement today, again, completely dismissing SADC's view that they had at the SADC summit on Friday, and again, being simply dismissive. But you can't also just have a leader that's completely dismissive of a very key regional body in Africa, of the steps that they think needs to be taken to bring about some peace. But the big issue for me is Goma is now in the hands of M23, James. How are we going to ensure that, do you get another party to actually then, through mediation, get the M23 out? What's actually going to happen now that M23 is, taking over control of Goma? How do you then take the steps back that the central government in Kinshasa again regain control? And I don't think those are some of the issues that I think we have not seen a clear roadmap or any indication how that is going to unfold.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all our guests today, Nicodemus, Minde, Crystal, Orderson and Yinka Adegoke. If you joined us late, don't worry. You can always watch the programme again on demand at aljazeera.com. If you have thoughts or comments on today's discussions or suggestions on what we should discuss in the future, please post them on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or reach us using X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and all the team here, please stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.